All right, looks like the gang's all here right at 2:02 p.m. sharp. Um, hey everyone, welcome to LAMINA1's first AMA of 2024. Super excited today. If you've been following along on Twitter and Discord as we've kicked off the new year, you'll know that it's going to be a pretty big one for LAMINA1. Coming up this month, we're about to launch our Creator Studio, which is a new tool set for creators to publish original content and game items onto LAMINA1, as well as the launch of a new demo space onto the platform. And some other exciting updates we'll be talking about in today's AMA and the lead up to LAMINA1 mainnet launch. As you guys can see, I'm joined on stage by three guests, CTO Will Carter, our Chief Product Officer Gordon Matty, they're both from the LAMINA1 core team side, as well as someone who you guys haven't met yet, Jon Radoff, who is the CEO of Beamable, which is one of our L1 early access partners. For some background, in today's AMA, we're actually going to be diving deep into the definition of interoperability. What is interoperability? What are its components? What are its origins, its use cases, its challenges? If you tuned into last week's Education Week, you'll know that we put out a blog post that kind of teases out these concepts in the lead up to our launch of interoperable content and items on LAMINA1 coming soon. So we wanted to make sure that you guys had a background in what interoperability means, why it's important or at least interesting to an open metaverse. And we thought who better than to bring on an expert whose work we had read a ton of when kind of building out this latest tool set. So I think before we dive in, Jon, as our sort of in-house interoperability expert and guest this week, do you mind making a quick introduction about yourself to the community? Who are you? Why are you here? And what are you up to at Beamable?
Sure. Thanks for having me on this discussion. So my background is I spent a lot of my life as a game developer. So I launched one of the first internet-based online games called Legends of Future Past, and then more recently spent about a decade at a studio called Disruptor Beam, where we built games based on very popular television shows that I would think everyone here has heard of. So stuff like Game of Thrones, Star Trek, Walking Dead. We built games based on that were mobile games. Star Trek Timelines continues to operate today, very successful game. But it was through that process that I saw a ton of problems that developers have when building games, especially big online games with sophisticated social graphs or sophisticated economies or a lot of complexity in them. And it really required a new technology infrastructure to make it easy for people to do that. So created a company called Beamable along with one of the engineers, the first engineer actually I hired from Disruptor Beam named Ali. He's our CTO now. And then our COO Trapper, who I worked with at a previous company called Gamer DNA, where we looked at gaming analytics. But our vision really is to make it possible for the smallest teams to launch their dreams into the metaverse, whether that's a game or any other kind of spatial computing or virtual world application that you can imagine, and essentially do for this market what Unity did for 3D graphics. So we don't work on the graphics side, we work on all of the tech that's underneath that lives up in the cloud or in servers and allows things to kind of implement social graphs and economies and blockchain integration and networking, all these things that you need to actually build big worlds.
Amazing. And yeah, I mean, I think, our visions are very aligned between Beamable and LAMINA1, the idea that we're trying to make it easier for world builders and people with creative ideas to get their content, up and shared with a lot of people. You're also, you've written a lot of sort of like articles, I know, on your Medium page and done a bunch of talks in the past about interoperability. Can you talk to us a little bit too about your sort of like interest and kind of like work and thoughts and past work around the topic that we've had us join you for, had you join us for today?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I started on Medium. I've shifted more towards Substack over the last year for a lot of my writing, but I do write a lot of articles on everything from interoperability to spatial computing to generative AI to game development. Really, virtual worlds is at the core of everything that I write. Meaning, how do you instantiate places online where we can interact with each other? And there's this word metaverse, which Neil, of course, coined decades ago, and that word is been used all over the place. It's been used by Facebook and Epic and other people who are interested in it. But there's just this all-encompassing concept of virtual worlds, whether you interpret that to mean metaverse or an MMORPG or any of these other terms. And that requires a framework that makes it easy for developers to not only build things, but really bring all the pieces together that make it possible to build online worlds. So one of the problems that we had seen at Beamable, and that I've just seen in my career more generally, is that when we talk about interoperability, first of all, it's important to note that, like, we often talk about interoperability as this broad thing where we want everything to connect with everything else and use standardized protocols and whatnot. But even within individual companies, rarely do people have interoperability. If you look at any given company, they're not interoperable within themselves, let alone across the internet. So we're talking about really, really hard problems to solve. And this is why I write about it a lot, because I try to bring a bit of pragmatism to this whole subject of interoperability. I think it's worth noting that we're all here right now because of a certain amount of interoperability. We have TCP/IP. TCP/IP is essentially the protocol that won out over many other kinds of protocols that existed in networking many decades ago and made possible the internet. And we're all here interacting across everything from Discord to online games to websites to you name it. All these apps use either TCP/IP or UDP, and that's an interoperability layer, right? So electricity and standardized electrical interfaces within our homes, at least at a given country, tend to be a form of interoperability. So usually what people mean when they are referring to interoperability beyond that is kind of moving up the tech stack or the behavioral stack from the base layer of communications, such as TCP/IP, up into higher and higher order structures that let you do more. So another example would be something like HTML on a website is a form of interoperability that defines the way we present information through websites. After the initial creation of HTML, people started latching on JavaScript to it to add more behavioral capability and programmability to it. So interoperability is a vast subject. It ranges everything from the way one defines the objects that you look at, like, for example, the 2D we see on websites, to the 3D graphics that implements objects within fully immersive virtual worlds, to sound and every other form of media that you can conceive of, but also the programmability, the way assets and data and information are exchanged between different kinds of programs, and not just the economic stuff that one tends to talk about in blockchain, where it is about decentralized exchanges and financial transactions, but a huge, vast number of things also require certain forms of interoperability. And I guess it all comes down to, like, why would you do this? At the end of the day, the reason why you do it is, number one, make it easy for game developers and developers of virtual worlds and all the people who want to build for the metaverse. Because if you can make it easy and I don't have to build things 24 different ways just to reach all the platforms that I want to be on, then I can actually implement a product that reaches massive audiences with much smaller teams. And then the second step beyond that is I want to start smushing applications together so that they can build off of each other, what is often referred to as composability in the context of web, quote unquote, Web3 type stuff. So composability is really just the idea that I can have programmatic elements that I combine together, and then that allows me to create more sophisticated applications that communicate with each other. An example of where this exists, but like, this isn't a completely novel concept. Like, it exists in the travel industry, for example, and maybe that's not great because it actually fails a lot. But for example, in the travel industry, hotels and airplanes and car rentals, all this stuff has over a course of time figured out a number of standardized interfaces for exchanging information and data, purchasing, reserving things, so that you can then have different websites that allow you to purchase and do things with those same data sets. And then there's a whole very overly complicated system of the way that then happens behind the scenes, some of which is technology dating back to the 1970s and 80s, but we live with a lot of those legacies beyond. So I think when we talk about interoperability today, we're talking about modernizing it for the metaverse so that things like 3D objects, yes, and financial transactions, of course, for things like blockchain and exchanges and whatnot are possible. But we're also looking at things such as behaviors, like what does it mean to have an object in virtual space? What kinds of capabilities does it take on? And how do those capabilities vary and manifest within different worlds and different presentations? So that's sort of something that I've been working on a lot, and that's very core to to tie it all together. I talk about this more broadly than Beamable, my company, but the reason I'm doing Beamable is because we are creating those interfaces and technologies to help tie together many of the different tools, IDEs, developer platforms, blockchains, data representation layers, multiplayer network code, all this stuff that is typically needed to build virtual worlds.
Amazing. What an introduction. I think, yeah, I think especially kind of like where we ended up, you did a fabulous job at kind of wrapping into like interoperability, the history, how it started, and where it's headed in terms of the metaverse. While we're taking a break and I'm pulling up sort of the next questions from the community, I did want to just share, for those of you who have not read our latest education series post on open metaverse interoperability, which is where a lot of kind of our upcoming questions from the L1 community are going to come from, definitely check it out, pull it open. It kind of overviews a lot of similar kind of use cases and kind of like layers of interoperability that Jon just mentioned. But I will say, as of last night, we did have over 800 questions from fellow builders for you and also for Will and Gordon about, what is interoperability? What does it mean? How can it be used? And especially like, how does it fit within the context of, what we're building at LAMINA1 or with our early access partners? So I think in general, I mean, Jon, you answered kind of like our first three questions, kind of defining what interoperability is, its use cases, and why people would, be potentially interested in enabling interoperable experiences across the metaverse. But I think in general, like, could you talk a little bit more broadly about like specific interoperability use cases like within the metaverse? There are obviously like a couple of layers to this, from like identity to assets to financial information, but I'd love for you to just kind of like overview like what does interoperability mean in the context of the metaverse, and like what are builders like you sort of like building in order to empower it? Like how far are we at empowering like an interoperable metaverse, like in your mind? Are we like early
Well,
days?
yeah. I mean, again, well, I guess we have to define what we mean
Mhm.
by interoperability in terms of what specific domain that we're talking about.
Yeah.
Um, for like when you talk about blockchain, people usually revert to talking about the financial transaction aspect of things. And 2 years ago, we didn't have any really particularly usable blockchains that were also relatively low cost. So when you talk about metaverse kind of stuff or games, a lot of what happens is microtransactions. So you can't be charging people like, whatever it is, 50 or $100 worth of ETH every time you want to do a transaction. You need very, very low cost, like fraction of a penny kind of cost is realistically what it has to be able to do transactions. So we have that now, and many of the layer one type networks that are available can do the transactions. And what does that enable? Well, it enables you the ability to have a person who's creating a world to push off the places where exchange actually takes place. So in the past, if you were building an MMORPG, like a big online game, for example, you'd have to go to, if you were, say, Blizzard and you were creating World of Warcraft, you have to create everything from payment infrastructure to auction houses to taking on all the responsibility of effectively being everything from the central banker to the monopoly supplier to yada yada yada, all the different functions, economic as well as technological, that one would have to do to implement an MMORPG like that. And this is a big part of why MMORPGs are extraordinarily complicated to make, very expensive to make, take years to make, and why the vast majority that have come in the last couple of decades, other than notable exceptions like World of Warcraft and Lineage and Guild Wars, those are the few that have survived in the face of many, many attempts to create these things, because it's just so expensive and complicated. So there's an opportunity by having more interoperability that people focus on building the pieces that actually matter to them. So if you want to make the best auction house, you can create a exchange that delivers a good experience for, say, a game player like experience that one would have in, say, World of Warcraft. Or if you want to make the experience of playing, you don't build the auction house, you just build the gameplay, which is frankly the biggest part needed in the world of quote unquote Web3 right now, which is, we've heard a lot of talk, we've heard a lot of, of things from people, and we've seen a lot of, screens with flashy graphics, but making a good game is not just making graphics and trailers. It's about actually having compelling gameplay, which is super, super hard to make. And it seems like we're actually a lot closer to that now. At Beamable, we work with developers that are AAA teams building great stuff. But anyway, it comes back to the idea of, if you're a team and you want to build a great game, then you just do that, and you have access to interfaces that would let other people supply the exchanges and the various mechanisms that allow one person to trade with another within that economy. So that's just sort of the basic use case that often happens with blockchain, but you can continue to build up the stack of what that means. So that's really just addressing interoperability at the economic layer. And I have an article where I kind of painted a picture of some of this stack. Maybe I'll link it in the chat or something at some point here when I'm not talking. But there's not only the economics exchange, but a big part of it is how one implements the behaviors within the metaverse. This is actually a really complicated thing. And frankly, it's one of the things that often gets critiqued by people who don't quite get the idea behind the metaverse. And what I'm referring to is, let's say I'm a metaverse which spans many different worlds and games, and there are two games in which the item can go from one place to another. Well, what does that even mean for that item to go from one place to another? Is it simply visual? Is it something that customizes the avatar? Is the avatar even represented in the same way between two different worlds? Maybe you'd have one game that's immersive 3D graphics and another game that's, a 2D retro look with pixel art. Is there a way that you can actually bring that art over? That would be an example of the vast complexity of interoperability as it relates to moving various items, customizations, or just a piece of graphics from different systems with each other. And then once you've brought the graphics over, the graphics is one thing, but what's the behavior mean? So if I'm building a game, I may not want that to have any particular logic within my game, because it might be game breaking to me, or I might not want someone, for any variety of reasons, to be able to import with them something that actually affects gameplay. I might want to control the gameplay experience. But on the other hand, there might be cooperating constellations of developers who want it to be meaningful. So if I am cooperating with, let's take one use case. Let's say I'm a dungeon master and I want to play in a Dungeons and Dragons universe, but I want to do something super cool, which is the dungeon masters are all cooperating within one shared universe, and we kind of agree on what our domains of control and godhood essentially are going to be within this world. So now we do want items to have meaningfulness as a character travels from one part of this living world to another. That would be an example. So I think that, there's a lot of interesting use cases in general that emerge for the metaverse that are going to look much different than what we've had in gaming to date. So I don't think that the most compelling use cases are necessarily going to be the big AAA developers like a World of Warcraft adding interoperability to League of Legends. I mean, listen, I don't think that's going to happen at all. It's extraordinarily unlikely that big, huge publishers are going to find ways to cooperate. On the other hand, when you take a lot of the technical complexity of how you integrate everything from the auction house type example that I gave a little while ago to graphic standards and things like that, and you really start enabling individual developers or small teams to start building content, you're going to start seeing different kinds of cooperative behaviors between those groups, because those are opportunities where teams working together, even though they're arm's length, they're working together from the standpoint of a collective economy or collective universe, can start to kind of add exponential value to each other. And there is one really great example of this outside of a standards-based interoperable metaverse, and that's Roblox. So the counter example to anyone who says, well, players don't want that. That's sort of a common refrain you'll hear, especially from more traditional parts of the game development industry, which is, oh, players don't really care. Well, that's not true, because they do. Like, Roblox has hundreds of millions of people on it. It's continuing to grow its monthly active user population month after month very consistently. And one of the interesting things that you can do in Roblox is buy things like an avatar customization in one world, and in some cases take it with you to another world. So it's essentially already proven within the walled garden, albeit the vast walled garden that Roblox is. I think you're going to certainly see a continuation of that. You're already seeing the continuation of that within UEFN, Fortnite's creator mode. So it really just comes down to, though, are we going to allow these interoperable playgrounds for virtual worlds to be controlled by Roblox and Fortnite, or Epic rather? I mean, I love those two companies, so I don't want to take anything away from them, but they are in charge of what's allowed within those worlds. They dictate the financial policies, they'll regulate the economy and the exchanges and what's even permissible. And I think the internet has shown us that over time, the way you actually unlock most creativity and most value for developers who want to build stuff is unleash individuals to just go do whatever they want. Like, that's literally why we have a World Wide Web where you can launch any website you want. And that's opened up the possibility to conceive of any application that you think the world needs, try it out, and see if it works. Within 3D immersive space and vast virtual worlds, we really don't have that yet. That's what Beamable is trying to do by making the development process easier. But there's so much other things that you also need, from economy integration to the way worlds are organized, so forth and so on, that LAMINA1 is certainly investing a lot in.
Yeah, and I mean, you've just given us kind of a great kind of leeway for me to open up the floor a little bit to Gordon and Will, I think, to kind of talk about, as user Danif0080 asks, like, I want to know about new developments coming to L1 and how they tie into this conversation that we're having around like the interoperability of items, spaces, and economies on LAMINA1. Gordon, do you want to just kind of like fill people in about like what's kind of coming up down our roadmap and how it kind of like fits into this interesting interoperable and open world that Jon just like outlined beautifully for us?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that We have a few questions, I think, covering interoperability, so I'll try not to cover all the questions in one response. Um, we're launching a new capability within the hub called the Creator Studio. Should be launching over the next week or so to everyone in the community. The Creator Studio is really a tool, and its goal is really to make it easier for creators of all kinds to independently publish and sell multimedia content, whether that's an image or it's an audio file or a 3D asset or a video, etc. Really providing creators self-service tools with no coding and no smart contract skills required to be able to publish content onto LAMINA1. And with a kind of a set of APIs, enable that content to be distributed into spaces. Spaces, I'm not sure everyone knows, are the term we give to applications of all kinds that interact with content and use content and provide the front end user experience to the customer. It could be a game, it could be a collaborative creative tool, it could be a spreadsheet. Like these applications could be anything that has content and has multiple people using it. I think in the very short term, what you'll see is a focus around these types of capabilities that are enabled within spaces that we're launching on LAMINA1. So when somebody creates a piece of content on the network, enabling that piece of content to flow into a space for use by users. And really what we're trying to do there is work with the developers in our community to launch example spaces that can take in content and demonstrate the kind of end-to-end life cycle of publishing content on the network and then consuming it and interacting with it in an application. In our kind of initial implementation, we're very, very focused on these kind of foundational layers of content and what is content on the network, because it's not only an image, it also includes metadata describing the asset. It includes metadata that describes the rights around an asset, metadata that describes the royalties around an asset. And it's really, really important that we kind of encode all of this information in the right way so that it can be as usable as possible as this content flows into applications. When Jon was talking about composability and these kind of interfaces around data, this is how we're approaching it in terms of ensuring the metadata is crisply defined and clear, so that it's very easy for people to take this content into their applications. And so what you'll see initially are a set of templates that kind of encode the specifications for each of these different types of items. A template is technically a smart contract under the hood that ultimately mints and manages the life cycle of an NFT. But these templates are initially going to be focused on audio and video and these kind of base media types. But over time, we will expand the templates to be much more in line with the use case of those templates. So instead of an audio file, you can think of things like a music track or a podcast or an audiobook. These are actually the content types that people care about. People don't care about audio files. They care about how they're going to be consuming this content. And so this is kind of an approach to creating these higher order objects, as Jon was speaking to, that can clearly describe an item and its context and how it needs to be used in the context of the item. So for example, playing a music track, that kind of playback experience is very different than potentially an audiobook, where you might be also delivering some text associated with the track to kind of keep track of what where you are in the book from a literatural perspective. And so the templates themselves are going to be very, very powerful. When we launch the studio, there's not going to be direct access to create templates, but in the future, we're going to be opening up the templating tool to everyone to be able to create their own templates and actually power experiences for other people by bringing kind of smart contract and coding skills and offering these kind of reusable objects that people can create on LAMINA1.
Yeah. Next up, I actually have one for Will. Deep Umo asked, we're talking about interoperability. We're going to be publishing this tool set that allows people to start kind of like publishing items that could potentially be interoperable across, multiple spaces, ecosystems, environments on Lamina1. So they're asking, will digital items be transferable to other blockchains in the future as well? And if so, are there any you're prioritizing? Will, we have not asked you a question yet, and I saw that you put your initial next to this one. So do you want to dive in a little bit? Is Lamina1 going to be, integrated and interoperable with other blockchains? Is that on the roadmap?
I can take this if Will is having problems with his
Okay,
audio.
yeah. It seems like he may be he's the one person we didn't sound check. No, we can't, Will.
Yeah, so interoperability. Uh, again, we're kind of starting at this foundational level where we're focused on like, how do we make an asset that can be published onto Lamina1 interoperable with a single application, right? That's the first goal. We did it with space lasers. We're going to be doing it with a partner application soon, and continue to kind of build out those demonstrations. The second step, and this is actually something great, Jon mentioned this, and it's something that I made notes around. We do see groups of creators looking to build potentially constellations of applications. Those constellations are interoperable with one another. A great example of constellations that we see today are applications like WhatsApp and Facebook and Instagram, where there is some interoperability, at least from an identity perspective, to support people being able to use each one of those applications. And Threads, I guess they have another application in their constellation. And we see this happening also on the blockchain. And we want to enable those use cases because we think they're very highly cohesive. There's a lot of economic connectivity between those applications if you get this right. And it can be very additive to the overall community. And then beyond that, we really want to drive interoperability of applications on Lamina1 that aren't necessarily in the same constellations. So that's kind of the next step. And then finally, when we get there, we're going to be looking at expanding interoperability across blockchains. Now, there's a lot of work that's happening in that space. This started off with the implementation of bridges to bridge NFTs and other, and fungible tokens between chains. Bridges have really evolved into kind of chain-to-chain messaging systems or interoperable messaging systems between chains from people like Chainlink, Hyperlane, and others. And we certainly are looking to formalize partnerships with those messaging systems to support items that are created on Lamina1 flowing into other chains and vice versa. It's really, really important to make sure those economies flow. I think in the short term, what that would mean is that EVM compatible chains will be fairly easy to kind of integrate with from our perspective. But then beyond that, we're going to be looking at being able to integrate with non-EVM chains like Solana as well. And then really that interoperability around kind of runtime environment is based on kind of like the data formats and how things are encoded, and making sure that when I send the item I've created on Lamina1 to a non-EVM chain, that all of the data, et cetera, all the metadata transfers correctly to the other chain. There are some technical requirements around burning and minting or locking tokens, depending on the bridges messaging systems implementation. But when we think about kind of metadata and interoperability, we need to make sure that data is correctly transferred to the other chain. There are also some really interesting use cases around, particularly in kind of these consumer metaverse experiences where you might not always want to transfer the actual asset to another chain. The reason for you doing that would be potentially to trade it, potentially to take a loan against it, perhaps. However, like if you want to play in an experience on another that's based on another chain, but pull an asset from, say, Lamina1, then we're looking at features such as asset mirroring that enables you to kind of create a mirror version of the asset on the chain where you actually want to use it, and then reflect any kind of like state changes back to the original asset on Lamina1. And so we think that these are maybe a little bit more interesting. We think that they're going to be much lower cost because you don't have to transfer the whole thing through an on-chain system. And it will open up a lot more use cases, we think, from a kind of interoperability point of view, from the consumer actually using content and assets within applications.
Let me add a little bit to that, because I think it's important for those who maybe are not like game developers from like a professional game development background to understand like just how vast some of these gaps on interoperability are, because it's not just at the level of like cross-chain blockchain based interoperability. If you open up Unity or Unreal and start building a game in they have the idea of a 3D object, meaning like graphics that can exist in space. But these are the two most popular platforms. They don't have the concept of an item. So you don't even have the idea of you're a user who owns some piece of property, even a virtual piece of property there. So you'd have to go find some solution to that on your own, or you just start building it. And that's one of the things we spotted with Beamable, which is actually give people who want to use like great tools like Unity or Unreal, actually give them the concept of there's a person with identity, and that person can have items that are associated with them, and those items can exist in a broader economy. Then there's sort of this last mile problem of how do you take that item representation and connect it to things like blockchain, which could record ownership information beyond an individual play session or even beyond the individual game, where you get this economic interoperability implemented. But I think it's informative to just look at the current state of the 3D engines and just realize that when you open up a 3D engine, you don't have a lot. Well, you have a lot in terms of graphics rendering and physics and things like that, but you basically have nothing in terms of economies and identities and items and the behaviors of worlds, the social structures of worlds. On that note, I thought I would share a couple of little articles that I wrote because folks who are interested in this subject might be interested. I noticed, Ivy, that I don't have the ability to post on the AMA stage. Maybe it thinks of some DJ that lurked in here or something. But I will be happily share a couple of links that folks might be interested in reading if they want a little bit deeper dive on these subjects.
Yeah, you should be rolled properly. Where are you trying to post it in the chat
In the
feed
AMA
itself?
stage. In the AMA stage, is there a
And
different
then it
place?
won't let you post links. Actually, Michael, can you whitelist him?
It doesn't let me post anything. It's like you do not have permission to send messages.
Okay. Yeah, we're gonna whitelist you. We've got our mods in the channel. Yeah, I will do that right away.
Cool.
While I'm doing that, I'm actually going to open up the floor for another question. I think I'm going to take things a little bit back. I mean, Jon, you're kind of helping us bring it back to the big picture for sort of like our last 20 minutes here. We do have like, we not only have, a lot of like Web3 builders, but we also have like Web2 and more kind of like traditional game builders in the LAMINA1 community. And they know, people don't like change. And this concept of interoperability is a big change for the way a lot of people think about, online experiences and their identity and all of that stuff. So do you have any sort of thoughts on, the best way to onboard or to help people make that transition?
Well, I mean, sort of the answer that people sometimes don't want to hear is they don't want to be onboarded. They don't want to even think about this stuff. I think you create great products that people download and install and use, or they play something and it's super fun. So it starts with the enjoyment of the experience way ahead of anything else. And players that engage in MMOs or experiences with a lot of fun, where there's also a deep economy present, they discover those aspects as they play. No, very few people dive into a game because they had heard it has a cool economy, right? Even games like EVE Online, which is renowned for its MMO economy, like people don't usually sign up for that. They sign up for it because it sounds like it's going to be this really kick-ass experience in space where you go and fly around and form teams and battle people and stuff like that. Like that's why they become part of it before they realize that you spend a lot of time like mining asteroids and exchanging various items with and currencies with people. So a lot of these games are gonna only work because they're fun. Like let's just put the stark numbers in perspective. There were 14,000 plus games that shipped on Steam last year. How many of those games did everyone here play? You didn't play 14,000 of them. You played a few of them, probably the ones that really surfaced to the top and were great and super fun, and you played them and you really liked it. So that's the way this is going to work. Like there's going to have to be breakout experiences that are super fun. That'll onboard people into it. And then once they're playing it, they'll discover the depth of the economy and exchanging things, or the fact that some kind of content is exchangeable across worlds in the same way they do in Roblox, for example. Like it's kind of the same thing in Roblox. You go into Roblox, you came because you heard there was something cool to do in it, you gave it a try. And if you happen to be playing a game which has an avatar customization that goes beyond the particular game that you're in and has meaningfulness outside of that game, that's not why you went into that game, but you discover it later, and then it's cool, and it deepens your relationship with the platform and the world and the particular games that share those connections. So I think like we gotta sort of get, we got to kind of get past the whole, tech aspect of this. Like there's people working on the tech, and I'm one of them, and the tech has to be solved. And we sell to CTOs, and we work with people who really care deeply about the tech. But at the end of the day, what people actually care about is experiences. And you're going to have to build things that are competitive with the 14,000 more things that are going to ship on Steam this year. And once that starts happening, then we've onboarded everyone. Then it doesn't matter. Beyond that, you could say things like, geez, the typical user doesn't want to think in terms of cryptocurrencies with values that float all over the place. They don't want to think in terms of complicated wallet installation processes. Ideally, the person is going to want to do what they're familiar with already, which is swipe the credit card, do a fiat-based transaction, and that's their first experience of doing an in-app purchase. That's probably, at least in the near term, what's required. Now, that may be very different long-term once they're familiar with particular cryptocurrencies or the economies of a particular game that they're in. But at least in terms of onboarding, it's going to be based on familiarity with purchasing processes that they're already familiar with from other worlds, and experiences that are top notch. And that's how you win the mass market of the 3 billion people that are out there already playing games. There's 3 billion people playing games. We want all those people to be in the metaverse. We want all 3 billion to be on LAMINA1. So that's what I think it'll take if we want to hit those kind of numbers.
Amazing. I've got another one for Will and Gordon on the LAMINA1 side. This is something, Gordon, that you kind of touched on a little bit, but I kind of want to take it back here, which is kind of around intellectual property, or like rights and royalties for assets that are created and kind of like shared across an interoperable metaverse. We've had a couple of LAMINA1 users who've actually gotten early access to the Creator Studio, and some of their first questions have been around like, how can or will the intellectual property rights of NFTs be protected for small creators or on blockchains like LAMINA1, or across this sort of like interoperable open metaverse ecosystem that we're talking about? Like, how is that possible? Like, how does that fit into this kind of conversation? I think it's a super meaty topic that I'd like to talk about just a little bit at the end here.
Will, are you back?
Yeah, testing 1, 2, 3. Let's see if we can get you on. Oh, still not working.
Okay. Well, I think so when it comes to kind of intellectual property and what we really mean here is your copyright, and the rights that you reserve by creating something something original. And what we've seen historically within the NFT space is that a lot of these rights are not very well described, if they are described at all. It's very rare that the property right that you might be giving to someone around the copyright, if you were to sell an item to somebody and they were to buy it, or if you were to send it to them and they would collect it, then they wouldn't even necessarily even know what rights they have, because generally the rights are on a web page somewhere else, and they're kind of linked to when you're buying the item, but they're never kind of referenced anywhere in the future. And so we thought there was an opportunity to encode these rights at the point of content publishing, so that by asking kind of the creator, like, what rights do you want to, do you want to give any copyrights? What are the commercial use rights? Are there any derivative rights, et cetera, et cetera? We can capture kind of their intent and what they want the asset to be able to do in the future, and then use that metadata to make intelligent decisions when the asset is being traded, or if it's being used in AI training, or if it's being used to create some other kind of derivative object. We can present those rights to those different types of users, and that's very different than what we've seen today. And so we think it's just going to be much clearer for everybody to have those rights be displayed. So, for example, in the hub, when you view an item that's being created in the studio, you're going to be able to see all of the information about those rights that have been encoded as part of that asset, and then those rights flow into applications where that content gets distributed as well. And when we bridge to other networks, those rights will also flow to other places. Now we're going to be encoding these rights both in kind of machine readable and human readable form, and that's really, really important, because it then enables us to interpret it within programming logic at different layers of the stack, as well as obviously giving people an easy way to kind of read and understand what rights they have with something that they may have acquired. Kind of related to rights are, how you might kind of reward people for, or how you might kind of like ensure that the copyright that you created has a revenue stream associated with it. This is something that's very difficult in the traditional world to do. Like if I sell, for example, if I sell, AC, a vinyl record from an artist that you love, and then you were then to resell that vinyl record to someone else, the creator has no visibility into that chain of sale and the chain of provenance. Using blockchain technology actually is something that this is very uniquely good at, in terms of being able to track the history and keep track of what's happening at any point in the chain, and be able to enforce any royalty streams that might be due to the original creator as items get resold kind of across an ecosystem of buyers. And so what we're going to be doing here is ultimately getting to a place where we can enforce royalties on those rights. We're implementing some basic standards that give enforceable royalties, but they're kind of like honorable. So anytime within the LAMINA1 system, any systems that we provide as part of LAMINA1, we will always honor kind of the royalties that the creator has set. What's really challenging and the more tricky is what happens if that item, that NFT, is sold in another third-party marketplace, like a Rarible or an OpenSea. It's ultimately going to be based on whether or not those marketplaces will honor that royalty specification. There are some very interesting developments around this in terms of being able to control where you want your NFTs to be able to be sold, ultimately giving the creator complete kind of flexibility in terms of saying, I only want my items to be able to be resold in marketplaces where rights are honored, and we want to provide an easy way for people to be able to take advantage of that type of technology, so that they can choose to turn off marketplaces that aren't going to honor the rights that they have declared. And so I think that kind of covers the two areas. I think it's the kind of really enforceable royalties is an area that's very encouraging. We've seen Limit Break launch some new contracts, ERC 721 1155C, along with some payment processor capability that provides this functionality. And we've also seen the Solana ecosystem with the Metaplex product support or implement the ability to have enforceable rights as assets go into different marketplaces. So we've seen some great implementations of it, and we're going to be looking to implement something very similar as we support enforceable royalties.
Amazing. These answers have been amazing. You guys have been making my job quite easy for me. I think before we hop off, Jon, is there anything else you kind of want to add on the topic? I see you got the links working. Thank you. Shout out to our moderator, Kat, for setting you up with the proper roles. But yeah, I mean, I guess before we kind of hop off, I'm going to share the secret code for this session for all of you guys. But are there any other sort of like notes or resources or things that you'd recommend to our community who want to dive deeper into the topic of interoperability before we head off?
The thing I would just add is that all the interoperability in the world will not really accelerate development that much until you have the tooling around these standards to make it easy to get stuff done. That's why 3D engines have worked so successfully, not because they're oriented completely around standards, but because the workflow for working in these environments has actually made it so that individual people that want to build something in Unity or Unreal can now do so without being graphics programming experts or DirectX API experts or knowing what a quaternion is or doing all the math. So the complexity that happens when you go beyond just the 3D representational layer and into the cloud with everything that goes from social graphs to economies to financial transactions to the way you represent persistent state in big worlds, that's an exponential level of complexity beyond the 3D graphics with a lot of pieces that have to work with each other. And that's sort of the challenge as I see it, which is how do you make it easy for the developer? Once you make it easy for the developer, then you start seeing all the kinds of experiences that everyone would love to have. Because frankly, the end user doesn't want to play like in a, circa 2003 kind of rough beta. They want to play stuff that's really fun and compelling and visually stimulating with good gameplay. And if it's not a game, just great experiences, as we see in even places like Roblox, which is getting better and better at this. So make it easy for developers. That's our mission at Beamable. We say we fight for the game maker. That's what's on my t-shirt. So that's what we're here to do. And it's the problem that can't be ignored to actually make these technologies like the metaverse have a meaningful impact on the world.
Amazing. Thank you so much for joining us today, Jon. This was a fantastic conversation. I am going to be posting this on our AMA recap channel, transcribing it, probably re-listening to it myself a couple of times after the session. For everyone listening, participating in our weekly quests, I'm posting the secret code in our chat right now, interoperability AMA. You can plug that into Zeely for a couple of XP points for listening in. And yeah, stay tuned this week for the launch of the Creator Studio, as well as some of the other exciting upcoming releases Gordon talked about today on the LAMINA1 roadmap. We know it's been a little quiet early this year, but it's just because we've been very heads down building this early infrastructure, and we cannot wait for you all to get your hands on it, start testing, and start kind of bringing this content to life with us as we continue driving toward our launch and a bunch of really exciting projects coming up. So Jon, thank you. Will, Gordon, thanks so much for joining. And I'm sure we'll have you on again soon. This is a great conversation.
Yeah, happy to be back anytime. And Will, don't sweat it that the mic didn't work, but geez, you just see the challenges of interoperability there. If we can't get a mic to work in Discord, imagine how much harder all these other things are to solve. I don't feel bad.
Yeah, well, Will was a powerhouse in the chat, so definitely if you guys have been listening in and you guys have not been reading Will's amazing responses to your questions, definitely scroll up because they're fantastic. Anyway, thank you guys all so much. We're gonna jump off. Thank you, John, and we'll see you guys in about a week for our next upcoming AMA. We'll keep you posted.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Thanks, John. Thanks,
Everyone.
Mike. Bye.
Take care.